Welcome to week 4 of Mpai 600 here at Georgetown University School of Continuing Studies Applied Intelligence. Just quick questions. Everyone here should have their paper 1 back. Good job overall. I think most people followed the guidance. If there was issues, you know about it. But just a couple of the broad brush pictures. The requirements, again, for the most part, were far too broad. And I know this is one of those things that you're not going to know until I comment on it. But the vast majority of you could have done one of your requirements, could have easily been an entire collection strategy. North Korean nuclear program was a popular one. Instead of asking, what is the issues in the North Korean nuclear program, get down to specifics. Will North Korea develop a mobile reentry vehicle capable of defeating our intercontinental or mid-course missile defense system? That helps. That's a threat-based, tightly focused requirement. Even then, you could go down a little bit further if you want to get into technicalities of third stage booster missiles and other reentry vehicles. Some people did border ISR. Again, you got to really get down to, don't talk about are UAVs capable of detecting migrants coming from this border. You got to get down to, does the Nogales to Santa Fe border crossing or what is the composition and disposition of migrants that the Sonora cartel smuggles across the border between the Nogales and Santa Fe border crossing? Even then, you could narrow down a little bit more going forward. Policy versus intel requirements. Most people focus on the intel. A couple of people who focus on the policy side, and I noted that for most people. Intel asset versus collection requirement. Again, some people ask the question, just like I mentioned earlier, can UAVs be used to detect smugglers coming across the border? Will North Korea missile tests be vulnerable to signals intelligence? You're not asking a question there. You're lining up a intel asset. It's not what we want. We want you to ask the important question first. What needs to be answered, as opposed to what can be answered. So please kind of focus on what needs to be answered. And then a couple of you did this. We didn't talk about this in the course, and there's going to be a course that you could take later on that talks about social media exploitation and open source intelligence. It is just a lot of you wrote this. Just keep in mind certain things are not applicable to social media. Obviously, North Korea doesn't use social media. MS-13, the gang, they radicalize people or bring people in the gang through normal, not internet, but normal familiar ties. So social media to find out MS-13 activity would probably not behoove you. Social media, again, for election interference, Russian influence operations in Eastern Europe, those would be vulnerable to social media exploitation. So good job overall. Well done for the most part. And if you have any questions, please let me know. So reviewing week 3, Pearl Harbor and the Yom Kippur War. So the DAL brings this up pretty well, and I'm just going to cover this in depth. There's 3 kind of arguments that the DAL brings. There's the traditionalist school, which argues that Pearl Harbor was an intelligence failure because there was just too much information. They couldn't connect the proverbial dots. That information was being collected and vacuumed up, that they couldn't figure out what was the wheat and what was the chaff. That's the Woolstetter argument that's outlined pretty well. There's the reformist school, which argues, and there's arguments for this in the Pearl Harbor disaster, that Pearl Harbor was caused not by too much information, too little information, but the information was going to the wrong people. The chains of command and the boxes, so to speak, the organizational boxes weren't aligned right. So information was here, but it needed to go here, and because they're not in this guy's not in this guy's chain of command, the information was not sent. There's legitimate arguments for this. This is an argument that the families of Kimmel and Short have made, that if I only knew what was going on in D.C. and was collected by Washington, we would have stopped Pearl Harbor. And they have some points. Information on shallow torpedoes was collected by collection assets in Washington that was never shared to the ground commanders. When we talk about 9/11, information was collected at the National Security Agency that was very relevant to stopping the 9/11 plot. But because of bureaucracy, because of classification, because of temperament, that information was not disseminated down to people in the local law enforcement or federal law enforcement that could have been done. Again, because that guy here didn't report to this guy. So you have that reformist school that says, hey, the informations weren't aligned right. And then you have the contrarian school, which argues that there's not enough collection going on, that there wasn't enough information. And there's a decent argument for this as well, that U.S., because of lack of collection, did not know where Japan's 6 aircraft carriers were. That's their critical asset. That's their most strategic asset on the eve of war. And that argues there was just not enough collection assets, be it human assets, be it people in the military attaches, be it submarine pickets, what have you, that could have known the location of those 6 aircraft carriers. So that's the contrarian school, and we're going to look at these schools as we look at other intelligence failures going forward. And you can also think about these when maybe there's failures that are going on now, whether it's COVID-19, whether it's the solar winds failure, whether it's the Capitol Hill intelligence failure, if we want to call it that. Does it fit along these categories? And then Dahl introduces a 4th category. I think he introduces, well, I have some issues with it, and I'll talk about that in a second. He argues that the information has to be receptive to military leaders and policymakers. That Pearl Harbor, and you saw the comparison between Pearl Harbor and Midway, Pearl Harbor, the military leaders that could have made a decision were not receptive to the vague intelligence that was being provided, that it didn't have enough definition, didn't have those locations, didn't have anything that would have caused Dahl or could have caused the military leaders to change their mind. I like the Dahl argument, or I like his book. I don't necessarily agree with this argument. And the reason why I say that is very rarely will you get that level of detail that it's receptive to the policymakers that he talks about. No one's going to say, sir, there's going to be 6 aircraft carriers coming in from the north, attack it Sunday morning at 8:55. That's not going to happen. No one's going to say, sir, there's going to be on 9/11, there's going to be 4 hijacked planes and these 4 flights, and they're going to board on these flights, and these are the 18 people or 19 people that are going to do it. That doesn't happen in the real world. For those of you deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, there's no real intelligence out there that says the IED is going to be in place at this time and this location on this road at this grid coordinate. What you'd have to do, in the IED scenario, is you have to use your inferences and your own judgment to reduce risk. In Pearl Harbor, I argue that there was enough information given in strategic intelligence, given the threat to Pearl Harbor, that the commanders could have implemented reasonable mitigation circumstances. And that comes to the Sharma School. It's not really the Sharma School. I'm just kind of being tongue-in-cheek there. But what the Sharma School will say is that intelligence drives reasonable risk mitigation. The Pearl Harbor, there was enough, and I believe this, you can disagree with me, which you're more than welcome to do, but there was enough assets, enough knowledge by the commanders that they could have, increased long-range patrols, canceled Sunday leaves, done any number of things that could have mitigated Pearl Harbor from being at least as disastrous as it was. 9/11, and we're going to talk about this, arguably, there was enough known in the law enforcement community, the intelligence community, the transportation security community that you could have implemented reasonable risk mitigation circumstances to prevent a 9/11. Let me give you an example. If you're flying now, which I know nobody's really flying now, but the next time you fly, you will see a drink cart in front of the cockpit whenever the cockpit door is open. That's not a very hard circumstance. It doesn't take you a whole lot of money. It doesn't take a whole lot of effort to do that. So based on like this nebulous threat of the potential of aircraft being hijacked and used as missiles, all you have to do is do a very simple maneuver, putting the drink cart there, and you don't have 9/11. You don't have to do it on every aircraft. You do it on 30% of aircraft. You stop a 9/11. So nebulous threat, reasonable mitigation circumstance. And that's, you can call it the Charmin school, you can call it whatever you want. But that's what Intel should drive. Reasonable risk mitigation circumstances. And I'm going to ask you to look at those for our next case studies and for your paper. Hint, 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 hint. So Yom Kippur War is next. And again, we still have the argument about what were reasonable mitigation circumstances that could have been implemented based on the intelligence. I just want to also just let you know, it seems like there's so over-reliance on human. There's actually a Netflix special I saw a couple of weeks ago, or popped in my queue, about Narwan. It's probably dramatized, but Netflix probably has a special for everything. But, you know, Yom Kippur War, they over-relied on one person. Narwan, it was Nasser's son-in-law, and that, you know, you never rely on just one source. Because just as I mentioned in the first class, humans make mistakes, they lie, they're just incorrect sometimes, and they over-relied on that one source. And that wasn't revealed until 2004, well after the Yom Kippur War happened, that they relied on that source. They had the addiction to preconceived notion, the concept that Egypt would not go to war unless they can neutralize the Israeli Air Force. What they didn't take, so they assumed that. What they didn't take into effect is maybe Egypt doesn't want to do a whole war, that maybe all they have to do is a limited war, and they could cover their ground forces under an anti-aircraft umbrella. But that notion didn't enter the Israeli mindset at all. And then lack of a kind of a net assessment. Israel relied on its Air Force. It was successful in the 67 Six-Day War, but they didn't do the assessment of aircraft to surface-to-air missile, tank to anti-tank missile, right? They focused on aircraft to aircraft, tank to tank, and assumed a qualitative superiority, when in fact you have to look at those asymmetries there. So that was the Yom Kippur War. There's also another HBO Max special on it I just watched, which is actually pretty good, about the first 3 days of the Yom Kippur War. Valley of the Tears, a little bit over dramatized, but you know, a lot of movies are. But you know, those two case studies are really the intelligence failure. And again, what were reasonable measures that could have been implemented? So week 4 preview. A lot of work this week. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's a rough week. A lot of reading, a lot of discussion board. 2 case studies: Iraq WMD and 9/11. Iraq WMD. The Rachel Maddow documentary. Again, you got to take this with a little bit of a grain of salt. Rachel Maddow she comes from a certain political perspective, but I think her documentary is for the most part accurate. Then you have the 60 Minutes curveball, 15-minute, and then you have the Senate Select Committee on Iraq. It is 200 pages. Do not read 200 pages. I want you to skim it and look at the blue boxes. You'll see it when you see the report. And these are the that really emphasize where the intel went wrong. And if you want to go in depth, you can read behind the blue boxes. That will give you a little bit more detail. But if you just kind of go through the headings and go through the blue boxes, you'll get the gist of the committee report. And then you have my lectures. And then we go to 9/11. You have documentary. I just checked the Nova NSA. I got to resend the link A lot of things are getting taken off YouTube, so hold off on that for a little bit. I'll resend or refine the link. And then the readings, you have the second part of the doll book, and then 9/11 Commission chapter. And then you have my lectures. And then I argue again, where could 9/11 have been prevented, and what reasonable mitigation circumstances could have been implemented? So that's all I have. If there's questions or issues, please let me know.